Sorry, Askell. Okay, we're going to call the meeting to order. And this is it's a workshop. We have two agenda items. And it's the meeting of September the 5th at a little after 1 p.m. at the Conant Auditorium. And the first thing we're going to have is a flag salute. And Jack, would you lead us in the flag salute, please?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Jack. Before we go into the workshop with Mr. DeMars, we're going to have an action item which deals with the adopt a resolution declared an emergency within the Imperial Irrigation District water power systems related to August 26, 2012 swarm of earthquakes that caused damages to the district's infrastructure. And Ralph Mesa, are you going to handle that, please?
Ralph Mesa, IID, Office of Emergency Management. Mr. President, fellow board members, I'm here before you to ask you to adopt this emergency resolution for the earthquake we had in August 26, 2012.
Is there a motion to adopt?
I move to adopt the resolution for the earthquake. Is this in the Brawley area?
Yeah, it was in the Brawley area. We had the manfill pipe that was slightly damaged, and also the spruce 6-string on Highway 111.
Okay.
Okay,
I'll second that motion.
Okay, thank you. Is there any board discussion? Okay, this is resolution number 31-2012, so would you please vote? All right, thank you very much. Thank you, Ralph. Okay, now we're going to move into the presentation by Charles DeMars' final Plan B report related to the quantification settlement agreement. And Mr. DeMars, would you come to the podium and start with your presentation? And we appreciate you being here with your staff. What'd they say? Well, I was told that there were not going to be any public comments. Is that correct, Gloria?
Well, I think if it's a workshop, there has to be the public's entitled to comment. Now, as far as the timing of the comment, that's
yeah. The comments can probably be at the end of the workshop. So.
What do I have to leave here? What's that? I may have to leave in about an hour.
Yeah, Mr. Garber, if somebody has a comment they want to make and they have to leave before Mr. DeMars finish up, and we have comments at the end, they want to make a comment now, is that appropriate?
I think it's up to the board. You can have comments now, you can have comments later, but you should allow the public to make comments.
Okay, that's fine. I was just told that the comments would be later. So if somebody has some comments, step to the podium, and you have 5 minutes to make your comments.
Thank you, JP. I didn't mean to come out of the woodwork there and question your authority here, but I've learned that if you don't speak up, nobody speaks up for you. So, and I learned that from Stella there and my parents. You know, yesterday I saw the DNC and one of the guys, or Salazar, said that dime con quién te juntas te digo quién eres, which means that tell me who you hang around with and I'll tell you who you are. And I really feel that it's come a time where we've already taken sides on what's going to happen in November. And to me, you know, the IV First, Imperial Group, the attorney from San Diego, and Imperial Group and everybody else are together and trying to get both you and Stella out. There's no hidden agenda about that. And see, they want people like myself and a few others here to vote for them, but they never hang around with us. So we don't hang around with them. We have nothing in common. I'm not part of their agenda. I'm not part of what they stand for. And to me, you know, I feel like between now and November, I'm going to be up here every time I get a chance to challenge what they write about you and us in the paper. Because they don't write and speak straightforward. They talk in riddles, and they defend themselves. All they want is your vote so they can get in, and at the end, that's what's going to happen, is that they want your vote, and then they put you to the side. It's just like Mr. Bruce Kuhn over there. He nothing personal, it's just political. He voted for the QSA, not knowing what's going to happen. I think Mr. DeMars is going to tell him that the QSA was wrong. He benefited from the QSA because he got monies for that, over $200,000. You know, transfer the water, and then I become a victim of the transfer, and I earn money on that, and that's what happened. You know, there's nothing against Bruce personally. It's all public. You know, he bought me breakfast a few months ago. I'm sure he won't buy me breakfast again. Maybe he will, but it's neither here nor there. And then Mr. Benson keeps saying that he's got an engineering degree. I'd like to find out in what college or university he got the degree, because some people told me that to ask that because they'd like to find out too. Now, is that being mean of me, people, to be up here challenging and putting those people on the spot? No. And Mr. Benson, I did call you and never returned my call, so I only called one time and that's it. And, you know, I don't know how much minutes I got, Gloria, the clock's not ticking, but more or less I think I'm towards the end of my conversation. And people need to be challenged, you know. Just like what happened yesterday at the DNC convention, I think, you know, I'm not a crying man, but Miss Obama, the First Lady, put a few tears in my eyes because what she said was true. You see a young lady walking there that was a helicopter pilot with no legs. And yet she said that she was a survivor and the ones that died were the ones that real heroes. And yet she was able to walk out there, you know, and say something good about America. So to me, ladies and gentlemen, to me this election is about the people. And the people who represent the people is Stella and J.P. Menville. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ramos. Anybody else?
Oscar Gonzalez, Calexico, California, 844 Encanto. You know, it's interesting that Mr. Rudy Maldonado, Mr. Bruce Kuhn, how is it possible that they sold us for 75 years? The Panama American Canal was 100 years, and the United States really benefit a lot at the expense of people from Costa Rica. I don't know if Rudy made anything because he was selling insurance and he didn't make it. He's selling insulation for Rudy. And you know, I'd like to mention this. I was in a car with Mr. Benson, and Rudy called. And one of the things he said, beware of Oscar. Beware of what? I'm not a crook. I'm not a thief. I'm not a child molester. I didn't sell out for 75 years, and that came out and had the audacity, implicitly and explicitly, I made a mistake. You don't make mistakes like that, people. But he's running, and I don't think he has a shot in the world. I don't know Calexico. I don't think they're going to support Rudy. Maybe Mr. Mike Morgan will, and others, but I doubt, because in politics, there's only two variables, and I've reiterated that it's money and votes. And I think that Estela, Mr. Desert, and Mr. Hanks have had probably votes and people, and I think all of you have done a good job. One may be better than the other, but it doesn't matter whether you're a wildcat, bulldog, or tiger. The bottom line is that you guys have done a good job, and you're trying to safeguard and clean up the mess that Rudy Maldonado and Bruce Kuhn, and I'm suing both of them. I'm suing Mr. Kuhn, and I'm suing in small claims Benson. He can't take an attorney. It's going to be he and I. The same thing with Porky Pig and I, Mr. Kuhn. And you know, Collab, they have the right, IV First, and even Mike Morgan, under the First Amendment, they have the right to push whatever agenda. I push an agenda But Rudy thinks that I'm a crook. I don't know what's wrong with Rudy. But I used to be a really good friends with this gentleman. And he started, you don't want to badmouth Oscar Gonzalez because it's like scratching the testicles of a tiger. When you criticize me behind my back and I heard it over the cell, I don't know what Rudy's problem is. But he sure ain't going to get my support, and he's not getting people that I know in Calexico and Valley-wide because he sold us out. And now we have to have Mr. Dumars and others. I know the farming community's upset, and I think Larry Cox and anybody, Don Brock, anybody belongs to any of those organizations, they have the right to do what they're doing. Just like Oscar Gonzalez has the freedom of speech to talk about, and I'm not supposed to judge them, whether their agenda is, but I know that I relate to them because we're human, and we have to respect each other. We have to impeccably speak. Don't take things personal. Don't make assumptions, and always do your best. That's what my mentor, one of my best friends, just recently gave me a book and donated 3 books by Mr. Ruiz, Estela Mendoza. Ingrained in that philosophy, Estela, were my dad's comments and mother's and your feedback and other people. And I think people in CoLab, even Mike Morgan, and they're human, and they have the right. They're not perfect, so they're pushing whatever agenda. This is America, Tony Ramos. Anybody can do what they want. That doesn't mean that I can judge him and say, I relate with him. We're human. We live in Imperial County. We're Americans. We got to get along. We can't be personalizing and speaking down at these people. They got families. They're doing what they think is best. So I support their efforts. I may not agree with them, but I think that they have as much right as Tony getting up here and putting people down. They've got the right to do what they're doing. Even Steve Caroni, or what's his name, Alex, I don't know his first name, but they have the right to do what they want. And they manifested that at the last election. But I think this is a second round. And I think those boys better watch out because we've got a surprise for them in November. I want to see Manville, and I want to see Estela, and I want to see Matt Desert 2 years from now, and even Jim, if they run, get reelected. But I think in conclusion...
Oscar, your time's up.
Is it?
Yeah.
Well, I love you, Mr. Manville. Thank you for reminding me.
Thank you. Anybody else have any comments? Otherwise, we'll wait. Mr. Coons back there. Come on up, Bruce.
Well, to paraphrase Tony Ramos, you can tell who a person is by the people hanging around. And again, I thank God every morning that this guy's working for you and not me. If I'm being sued, I didn't know it. And I guarantee you, when you do, you will have stirred a rattlesnake with a very short stick, because I will counter-sue the crap out of you.
You won't sue counter crap.
Oh, yeah.
Oscar, Mr. Kuhn is talking, so please be quiet.
Anyway, so I've not been served, but in the event I am, I stand ready to defend myself because I don't know what they'll be suing for. All I did was give him money and pay his motel, and then he got kicked out of one. They said he was crapping in the floor. Well, I'm just telling you what the man said. Hey. Anyway, and so if you can tell who a person is by the people they hang around with, this guy has restraining orders placed against him. Can't go into City Hall in Calexico. That's I'm proud of you. I suppose they lifted the restraining order, and that's a good thing, but it was in place. Anyway, to be assailed by a guy like this is almost a compliment, because he is everything I'm not. So, I think I've said enough. The guy is nuts.
Thank you, Mr. Kuhn. Anybody else for public comments? Otherwise, we'll wait till after Mr. DeMars. Norma?
Mr. Chairman, members of the board, my name is Norma Sierra Galindo, and I am a candidate for Division 5. And I would just like to ask a question. Perhaps your legal counsel can provide an answer for it later, but it is my understanding as a public official that when special board meetings are held, the public comment should be limited only to the business at hand. And whereas it is very important to accommodate everybody's needs and everybody's comments, sometimes that tends to stray us from the business at hand. It would be kind of you if you would let me know exactly what the Brown Act says. You can let me know later.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Norma. If there's no further public comments, we'll proceed with Mr. DeMars' presentation. So, Chuck, you have the floor.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we appreciate you coming out, Chuck.
Really glad to come out, and wanted to explain a little bit about our presentation today. We've had an opportunity to present and review with you the contents of our first draft and of our second draft of the report. Finalized that report, and it's available. It'll be available online. I think I'll describe in a moment some of the things we worked on in the report. But insofar as I haven't been served yet, so and I'm not from here, but I know a little about this topic, I thought it might be useful for you to hear my frank comments about our observations. And it's nothing that isn't in the report. I just wanted to emphasize some of the points in the report. And Patrick Redmond is here with me, and he's going to talk about some of the environmental issues. And then we'll go through what we are proposing, our law firm is proposing. And the first item, let's go to the first slide. Do we have a clicker somewhere? Gloria, tenemos un ratoncito.
Oh, I'm sorry, Chuck.
Oh, no problem.
I didn't know it was here.
No problem.
It's this arrow right there, and you're really pointing at the... Is it on? There you go.
There you go.
It's that
Okay.
arrow right there.
All right, thanks, Jeff. The first thing I would like to do is talk about the comments we received. We received a number of comments. I was interested to see that the regional plan, the plan that just came out, didn't receive any comments. There was a sort of on it, and that's because it was a more generic. This one, though, we received a number of comments, and the way we decided to deal with those comments is we summarized them and put them in an appendix, a paragraph on each one. Many of them were lengthy, but I think that we did the proper thing in characterizing what those comments were, and then we referred to where you could find the actual comments, because many of them were thoughtful, some were critical, as they always are, but we were really gratified to see the amount of input. The comments ranged from ones addressing our financial calculations. We had calculated, based on the assumptions of our accountants and our CPA firm, that there was a substantial potential for a big deficit of around $1 billion if things continued the way they were under the QSA as it's currently operating. The response from the CFO was, yes, it was really not critical. It just compared their assumptions, and two of the assumptions they challenged. One was the assumption we included in the possible effects of the QSA and the revenue expenditures, the continued subsidization of the water department over the life of the QSA, in that the response from Mr. Broking was not critical, just simply said, well, in his view, you can't include that because they will probably come up with revenues elsewhere to cover those costs. And we simply said, that's not reflected anywhere where that's going to happen, but we understand that. The other one had to do with comparisons of interest rates and whether or not we should include in our calculations obligations that were not legally binding on the IID. For example, there's a cap on obligations to pay for mitigation costs. In ours, we concluded that probably it was likely that if there were substantial mitigation needed, the IID would step up to the plate. That would be a cost that you should, if the state isn't going to pay for it, you ought to do that. But overall, I'd say that most of the comments, including those from Mr. Oking, were all fair, and they were just simply trying to clarify what was being said. I would recommend you look at the way we characterize those, and I think you might find that interesting. The other thing that we did was, which in response to comments and also in response to the way we had framed something, now, when we originally submitted our report, and I'll get on to the regular, we had suggested that the decision in 1600 should be reversed. And we continue to be of the view that the principles in that case, the principle that the IID is wasteful and that allowing water to go to the Salton Sea or any of the activities involving the use of water, that constituted waste, we continue to object to the correctness of that principle. We do not believe that the IID is wasteful just because for many years it sustained the Salton Sea. So we're not suggesting that particular case be reversed. We're saying you can never concede in the inaccurate proposition that because the IID has return flows that have, not return flows, but has tailwater that gets to the sea, that was wasteful, and that changing that corrects something that was wrong at the IID. That is not our view. Our view is that the IID has various uses for water that it can conserve, it can increase efficiencies in different ways, and we'll do that, but we challenge the correctness of that decision. What the other two items on there, what we've done is we've divided our presentation into two parts. The first is just my comments and Patrick's comments to you about what we think are the most important things out of the report. The second is this proposition. Our view was that one of the biggest problems with the QSA is that it was enacted under tremendous political pressure, under great time constraints in response to the 417 proceeding, and that there was never time to develop, for the board to develop principles that it would apply to the QSA as it continues to need change. There's never been a set of formal resolutions saying this is what the board believes the QSA ought to accomplish. If any potential change or legal case accomplishes that, fine. If it doesn't, then the board concludes that that change shouldn't be made. Or if it needs to be changed, it's based on these principles. And we've offered up those principles, and we've offered up some resolutions I'll talk about in a minute. This was one of our observations. It was a political choice to superimpose the QSA on the IID. It was the political choice made by powerful people in the state of California, the Bureau of Reclamation, a whole host of very powerful entities who needed water when they couldn't get it up in Northern California. It was superimposed upon the IID, and the one way to do that, one way to make that choice palatable, was to just assume that conservation could be done, that would generate the water, and there would be a win-win. Just assume it could be done, have a theoretical study done, look at the definite plan report, put it together, and assume it can be done. And therefore, it was possible to sign it. But the first thing that we have confronted as we go forward is the question, what happens if the exact amount of conservation is not possible and the best efforts have been made to do it? What happens then? Do you get sued by San Diego and do you hide and say, we're sorry, we'll have to pay you damages? Or do you simply take the position that you believe that there's a reasonable standard, and that once you're doing your best, even though it was theoretically a good idea, it doesn't follow that the water that can't be conserved is wasted. it doesn't follow that water goes to other junior users. That's got to be, in our view, that's got to be the proposition that we're doing. I think you are doing very well. You're trying really hard. You've gotten some new theory, some very practical things you're working on in the area of conservation. But it doesn't follow that if it doesn't work exactly as planned, that they can come in, that anyone can take your water. This one really goes to what seemed to be the most obvious point. When the QSA, almost 10 years ago, when the QSA was put together, everybody working hard to try to solve an incredibly thorny political problem. The problem being that California had an entitlement of 4.4 million acre feet total and was using 5.3 million acre feet. When they superimposed a solution on to basically to take the water out of the IID through a conservation, those were very different times. At that time, everybody believed that there was no limit to the economic viability of the state of California, that its budgets would continue to grow, the tax base would expand, that all of the high tech would expand and the economies would grow. And ultimately, everybody believed that it might be, or at least some believed it might be possible to both work with the Salton Sea, mitigate the effects on the IID area, on the valley, and make this all work. The true simple fact is the diminished, as I call it here, the diminished viability of government support for conservation and environmental goals. You're running up against the fact that the state doesn't have much money. And if it doesn't, and if you are confronting the problem, you need to address it, not presume away the environmental costs, and not presume conservation if it isn't happening. In 2013, you have some conservation goals to meet. The fallowing is over, and my view is fallowing is not conservation, it's the destruction of economies. Unless it's done under very regulated such circumstances. It's possible, but you've got some goals, and the truth is that this is just me talking. I'm not from here, but you are confronting some pretty frightening obstacles if the state government can't step in and support you, and if your partners, San Diego and the Met, won't support you. There are issues there. That's just my view. I guess if either one of these doesn't work, if conservation doesn't work so you can produce the water, or if the environmental mitigation doesn't work, you're in a world of hurt, because those are the two major premises of the QSA. One of them was that the state would step up to the plate and cover all costs over $133 million for mitigation. The argument was made in court, in the Court of Appeal, that it wasn't a binding obligation, because if it was binding, it would be unconstitutional. It isn't. It's turned out to not be binding, and even if it were, if there's no money, it becomes a moot point. So that's the environmental side. But on the conservation side, you really, it's been our observation from looking at the Conservation Advisory Group, you look at what farmers do here, you even look at the total of the staff, the talent you have here, you can do this, but it's going to involve being creative. When you have 60% of the people who are basically landlords or absentee landlords, and you have tenants who are responsible for much of the choices regarding water use, to me, it's really vital that you give those people who are in the short term. If, for example, a person could put drip on onions or carrots or some particular crop just for a cropping season, if you could prime the pump and make it work, you need to do that. You can't be inflexible and say, no, our theoretical studies say it has to be this way, the QSA says you have to do that. You better step up and take control of your conservation future. The other point that our accountant continues to stress is that somehow it's vital that you get control of and understand, and I know you do, But it wasn't until a year and a half ago or so that you even displayed your water operations budgets separately from your QSA revenue budgets. You've used the QSA revenues, and I'm not saying this is necessarily a bad idea, but you use those revenues to do generic support and all kinds of work on the water operations. That's okay too. It's all part of the same pot. But if it's the view that it is going to be that the QSA is going to, the revenues are going to perpetually support the water operations budget, and you don't have a handle on where that goes. I mean, we have models in many, many cities in many states, where, including this state, where they projected revenues that never came about. You've got the QSA, it has issues. All we're saying there is please account for them separately. Each time there is a choice, you need to make sure that it's the board's choice to develop dependence on revenues that are tied to QSA obligations, which are conservation and environmental mitigation. If you're going to blend them together, go ahead, but make sure that you're going to then use bonding money for something else. But it's a really, I guess my view is you are not in the business of water conservation. You're in the business of supporting the crops in this valley, supporting the people who live here, protecting the environment of it, and carrying out the trust responsibility. The lever which drives it should not be the QSA revenues. It ought to be choices the board makes. There are a number of environmental issues. I'm going to let Patrick talk about these, and then I'll come back to the last. And then we'll just go through the principles we think that flow from that, and we think you might want to adopt. You may not want to adopt any of them, but we're just laying those out for you. Go ahead, Patrick.
Thank you, Chuck.
Good afternoon, and I am Patrick Redmond. I'm a New Mexico and California attorney with Mr. Dumars' office in Albuquerque. I want to thank the board for the opportunity to look at the Imperial Valley and the IID and how the QSA can be improved. It's been very rewarding experience and very educational experience. I just want to, for this one or two slides, I just wanted to point out some of the pressures. We're calling these the new realities to which the QSA must adapt or be adapted. These are pressures that, in our view, are forcing the QSA, or should force the QSA, in a different direction, implementation of the QSA in a different direction. Now, the first one here, Chuck has already touched on, which is the assumption on which the approval of the QSA was premised, that the state was committed to lead the charge on both mitigation of the transfer impacts and restoration of the Salton Sea. And it's become apparent and increasingly recognized that that state commitment is likely not forthcoming. And it's been recognized, first of all, by a recent shift in momentum to more local control, as evidenced in Assembly Bill 939, which I think is near passage at this point, as also recognized in the petition for change of the Water Board's Water Rights Order 2002-013, in which the IID itself made the argument that the state's action toward the Salton Sea could be better characterized as inaction at this point. Another pressure that should drive the QSA in a different direction is the development of new synergies in mitigation and potential Salton Sea restoration activities and mitigation measures, such as the new Species Conservation Habitat Project, Early Habitat, the new Habitat Conservation Plan, which is still in draft form, new air quality mitigation plans. And the third item here is the recognition that the IID and Imperial Valley agriculture exists in a regulatory climate which is not self-determined, that there are external pressures coming from the EPA regarding air quality regulation, specifically those Regulation 8 fugitive dust rules, which have been the subject of controversy with the EPA recently. I understand there's been a settlement reached with the EPA, and the rules are in a draft revision stage right now. But there does need to be increased cooperation with the county and with the Air Pollution Control District. And finally, another pressure driving change in the QSA is the recognition that the climate, the physical climate, is changing, and that the Colorado River supply is in jeopardy. There are long-term modeling results showing changes in precipitation, in snowpack, in temperature, and I think the Bureau of Reclamation right now is compiling a report on changes in the Colorado River Basin supply and demand, which shows that there is increased pressure and constraint on the water supply itself. So with that, I'll pass it back to Chuck.
Okay, thank you, Patrick.
Make a point on the second one. There is this new supply and demand study that the Bureau just completed. I've read a draft of it. And truthfully, whenever you have any federal agency looking at supply and demand of a river system, invariably the people doing it, particularly federal regulators, say what we need to do is we need to figure out how to equilibrate supply and demand. One of the ways to do that historically and almost virtually always is to move water from less populated areas to urban areas and to decrease water for ag. And the final statement, typically covered in a footnote, would be, say, one of the biggest impediments is the prior appropriation doctrine, because if we could simply match up supply and demand, we could make it work. But darn it, those people who put water to beneficial use, prior to the turn of the century, they have rights, and we have to contend with it. I'm just saying that is yet another constraint on the QSA, and even though you worked out a compromise, it doesn't mean it's going to hold. There will be federal pressures, in my view, to even make, in many ways, that compromise more difficult for ag than it has been. I guess this is my final point. It's that, as I said before, when the QSA was, when the pressure was on, when there was a great deal of zeal from people from the Bureau of Reclamation like Bennett Rayleigh, who I know, from the people in the upper part of the Colorado River Basin, Nevada, and others pushing to fit ag into a pigeonhole, it was, what do we care about ag? That's just a little piddly $38 billion industry in California. It's only about $1 billion in the Imperial Valley. We can manhandle those people because we're having so much success elsewhere. Now, look, the shoe is on the other foot. In my view, the sustainable agriculture and food production is becoming more and more a politically powerful element. It's sustainable in the sense that things can be reused, land, and the way in which it dovetails with environmental benefits and the totality of the picture really puts the agricultural community in a much stronger position than they have been, and it should no longer be an apologist for use of water, but the fact that it's out here, you have the people who are living on ag, you have the people in this community, you have people who are, even though unemployment is high, you still have something better than what's going on in Stockton, California, and places like that. You don't have bankruptcy, you're succeeding. I'm just going to skip over this one. So let me just tell you now, the next part of my presentation is the guiding principles. We searched all over the place. We talked to people, we talked to individuals, we talked to Kevin. Kevin came the closest to anybody that I met who could describe for me what he felt were the guiding principles for the IID, what they were trying to, his history of it with the public relations before that, a manager, and position presently. But there was no one place where the principles that should be applied by this board were located. So there's a controversy. Suppose next week the Bureau of Reclamation comes in and starts leaning on somebody. Suppose there's an environmental group that files suit. Suppose there are any innumerable things that can happen because the value of your asset here is incredibly large, and the demand for it, given climate change and scarcity, is growing all the time. So what are the principles that the board ought to use? What should they be? So the first one that I came up with is this. The QSA is out there. It's an agreement. Lawyers write agreements. Your general counsel, talented lawyer, writes agreements that are directed for him by the board to write. Lawyers litigate cases. But the QSA is agreement. It is not the charter for the IID. The IID has its own charter, which is set out in its statutes and in the policies, historical policies that have been carried out over the years. So my point there is, if it's not the charter, then it can adapt to change. And when there's a proposed problem with the IID or with any area, the mission of the IID controls over the QSA. It's just an agreement, an important agreement, structured at a time that was politically very difficult, but times have changed and they will continue to change. So that's the first principle. Our second principle is that you can't expect an agreement, even of that magnitude, to remain unchanged. Circumstances change. That's nobody's fault. The California is broke. The Court of Appeal ruled that they have no duty to pay for the mitigation costs with respect to environmental issues. The conservation issues are prolix and complicated. Things change, and the second principle is the board should be willing to meet with its partners and discuss the impact of change and adapt the QSA to meet needs. This is not any proposal other than to adapt. Getting back to the principles, these are the 4 principles that you may want to adopt. When legal conflicts regarding interpretation of the QSA or policy conflicts, or you have such a wealth of resources, you're running into conflicts between different forms of energy, solar and ag, taking up land, multiple conflicts. You need to have some principles that we say that are derived from our report. The first one is that it's the principle that you measure any change, whether it's to the QSA or anything else, against the obligation to support and promote efficient, sustainable agricultural development in the valley. Either that's the principle that you believe or not. To protect the air and water quality of the valley, support and promote the economic viability of the communities in the valley because they live here and they are sustained by and part of and contribute to the process. And finally, protect and preserve the water rights located within the valley. So the principle that I'm saying is for every significant legal interpretation involving the QSA, because you're going to have many, many more in the future, it's the duty of the board to demonstrate to the public that the legal position taken by IID comports with and ensures compliance with these missions. Either it does or it doesn't. If it does, you take that position. If it doesn't, you challenge it and you work out a position that does. I think a principle that might be useful to consider is whether or not it's good fiscal policy to, first of all, whittle away at future environmental costs. If you have an environmental problem, invariably political institutions try to downplay it and say, no, it's not going to cost that much. It's not going to be, we can make it less significant. Our revenues really will cover it. The costs, you got to stay away from, the principle would be, do not presume away environmental costs if they look real to you. And the second one is, don't presume revenues. Don't presume revenues are going to come in if there's a chance they will not. If the QSA and the mitigation costs or the conservation issues are coming up, don't presume revenues. And at every time you do a financial forecast and an annual report, display the economic viability of the IID with QSA revenues, and if there were no QSA. So you segregate them. You're not in the QSA isn't the charter. It is a very important agreement, but it isn't the charter. The charter is the missions that I just described. I guess the next one is, you already do this, but I would say it doesn't hurt to refresh your recollection on this one, and it would put it in a set of principles. That the most important part of stewardship is transparency. That's the most important part of stewardship, because if you're stewards of a resource that belongs, it is providing benefit to a community, and you're a huge part of the community, as IID does, you employ people, you are really integrated at every level. Transparency and community involvement are the key. That's really, if you don't have that, then you get mistrust. With the mistrust, then you can't carry out your other missions. I guess another principle is that, and it's an obligation under the QSA, but I really think that a principle you should adopt is that you intend to be flexible in your approach to experimentation by irrigators, optimizing the factors that will achieve on-farm conservation by letting the conservation advisory group or anybody that actually is doing it, let them come to you with suggestions and embrace them. Don't throw up legal barriers to them by restrictive views. The QSA is not, it's not the charter, it's an agreement. The charter is to support and sustain ag, and if you can do the on-farm conservation, there's a great potential for win-win. I guess another point that I have is that we made in our report, I do think really it is really important to bring all of the technology you can in-house. Have those people working for your board directly. Don't rely on consultants. Guess I just cut my throat there, but don't do that. Bring the technical people in-house and use them in-house, because they are going to be the ones that are responsible for the consequences, and they will report directly. There's nothing more frustrating from my perspective and for some of my other clients to have a person who's a consultant. I can think of one example where the person had he had a particular kind of gate that was electronically operated that would not operate in a certain way, but he insisted that we buy that, and we went and looked at it, and it didn't work. And when the more you can bring it in-house, the less you have to rely on consultants. Not that because of conflict of interest, but just because you want control over what they do. They work for you. This is another point, and it's the one I made earlier. It should be your policy that you do not accept that just because you can conserve more water by subsidizing conservation and encouraging people to conserve, it should be your policy that it doesn't follow that if you can't do it because it's economically unfeasible, you're wasting water. Under no condition can you ever concede that if you've done your very best, that you are somehow, that your use of water is currently wasteful. It's just a function of economics, the technology required, the numbers, the actual numbers in many areas for the feasibility of conservation, they are a very small margin. It takes a great deal of effort, but mostly it's personal. It's not the technology, it's the people. And if you're not inviting them and if they're not involved, it's not going to work for you. I'm just going to go through these. I've made this point already. I guess another principle and it's included here, is that when in the process of conservation.
Can you take the environment?
Yes, please. Yes, go ahead.
Okay. So this is the first environmental principle that we've distilled in our report. And this is discussed in many different ways within the report. I would say the best illustration of this principle is that in a typical water transfer within a prior appropriation system, the lost opportunity costs and the historical and projected value of resources is reflected within the transfer as part of a market-based transaction. Where the QSA differs is that it's a mandated transfer. And so this principle is an expression of the general principle of rationalizing and making equitable the allocation of risk in a transaction. So it reads that in order to be sustainable, an agriculture to urban water transfer like the QSA must account for the extent and the scope of environmental and economic benefits provided by the water in its original agricultural use. And it needs to adjust or to be adjusted so that the burden of environmental and economic risks due to the transfer of the resource is allocated rationally among the beneficiaries of the transfer. And that would include the local transfers, the urban water recipients, and all the other transfer beneficiaries. The second environmental principle reflects what we recommend in the report as a more proactive approach to be taken by the board to adjusting the QSA and implementing the QSA. We recommend that the board's approach should reflect acceptance of its share of the affirmative obligation of addressing mitigation and eventual restoration of the Salton Sea, mitigation of the transfer impacts, again, equitably and rationally, with the share of risk to be accepted by all the beneficiaries of the transfer. But the key point here is that it's not in the IID or the Valley's best interest to characterize those who insist on appropriate environmental mitigation as the enemy, because it is in the best interest of the IID's mission as well as part of its responsibility to constituents to see that the economic, the environmental, and the quality of life of the Valley is sustained. And our final point here is sort of along the same lines, that as a political subdivision, as the preeminent economic driver of the region, the IID is integrally interrelated with the health of the regional environment and the economy and the regional imperatives for environmental regulatory compliance. And one of our guiding principles distilled from the report is that service to all of the IID constituents requires that the IID acknowledges its shared interests with the County of Imperial in evaluating and adjusting the burden of environmental risks imposed by the QSA water transfers so that these transfers are made environmentally and economically sustainable for the long term. And with that, I'll pass it back to Chuck.
This is the last one, and let me just tell you again, this is my observation. When you have here a multi-billion-dollar operation with the QSA, it's a hugely significant agreement, and it was an attempt to squeeze together something that would save the state of California from, in some of the urban areas, from tremendous pressure from the federal government and the upper basin states. It was an attempt to try to at least theoretically come up with a solution that works. You have a water department. You have a whole division that covers the area of water distribution. You monitor every drop. You have an entire cadre of people monitoring that. But on the QSA side, there isn't such an organization. You've got a JPA in which San Diego and the Met and others talk to Bruce about, and the Fish and Wildlife Service, about the best way to pursue environmental goals. And you have informal conversations, but you don't have in place a part of this board, a group that addresses this huge multi-billion-dollar operation. You've got legal counsel that handles the cases. You've got your own legal counsel who gives you advice on particular issues and separates himself from those so that he can not be involved in those other issues to give you objective advice to the board when you ask him. But you don't have any entity like that, nor do you have any mechanism for evaluating legal choices, legal cases, or even major policy issues. So my suggestion here is this principle would be that you institute some group within the IID whose responsibility is to evaluate QSA choices. I don't mean lawyers, I mean staff, I mean technical people. So when things come up, you have a group of people who are responsible for that. And finally, when you put together whatever proposal you have, then you should have an impact report that should be binding and mandatory. Somebody says, we're going to, there was what I considered to be a really good decision, and I've continued to do that. You're going to have people deciding maybe you're going to adjust fallowing, or maybe you're going to do more things with the agricultural community, promote conservation. Whatever choices those are, you need an impact report that everybody reads, and it's evaluated based on the principles, and then when the decision is made, you have some legislative history, and you don't have people complaining, I never got that email, or I wasn't at the meeting, or when did the lawyers decide to do that? This, the lawyers work for the board doesn't, and if you don't step up and come up with it, then it's natural that the people with leadership roles in the law firms are going to do so. I have to confess that when I first started representing one of my major clients, an irrigation district, I viewed my role differently. I finally realized that was a huge error for me to step up, and they now have a whole department that deals with endangered species issues and technical people. It's a mechanical thing. It seems like a small thing, but I think it would be very significant to you, and it would get rid of a lot of headaches about misunderstandings as to why you did it. All right, the other thing that is what we recommend is you have some proposed resolutions that I put together and were refined by the staff here, and those resolutions would do the following. One of them, if you choose to adopt it at the next meeting, would accept the report and its findings as being a useful guide to the operations of the IID. Another would be the resolution would simply say you adopt these principles to be binding, including the obligation of an impact report, and that you would accept those principles or whatever version you consider to be appropriate as binding on yourselves, and have a debate about that and adopt them if you believe that was appropriate. And the third one would be, we recommended to set up some committee structures. We don't know these are the right committee structures, but it was our view you need to start by getting an institution in place to address these very complicated issues. So you have those three resolutions in your packet. Those are, I believe, online. Ya están disponibles. Yeah. So they are available, and so that will be, I think you have a discussion on the 18th, but we just wanted to lay out for you our candid views, give you the report with all of our suggested changes, and then basically stand for questions or however you'd like to handle the meeting, Mr. President.
Okay, thank you, Chuck. Mr. Kelly, we'll have board members have any questions, and then we can go to public comments. Is that the way you want to handle this?
Yes, and these resolutions are slated to come back to your board on the 18th.
Correct. Okay, is any board member comments on Mr. Lamar's and Patrick's presentation so far? Okay, we'll go into public comments, and then we can have some board comments after that. So if anybody in the public wants to speak, please step to the podium, and you have 5 minutes. State your name for the record, please. Mr. McBroom.
Art McBroom, farmer, Calapat, President, Pearl County Farm Bureau. I'd like to thank the board for inviting Mr. Dumars, and I'd like to thank him for what he said and what he did. Probably just one word that would, I think, sum up, and it would be ditto on what he said today. I think it's a breath of fresh air to hear a perspective that doesn't have a vested interest in what's going on here, or a slant or a spin that we need to look at. I think one of the things that's been so frustrating for us in the farming community, especially on the Water Conservation Board, where I'm a member as well, that we find that so many times that we offer up solutions and we offer up ideas that we're always told no, that we can't, or no, we can't do that because of the QSA. And I think with what he talked about today, with it being an agreement and not a charter, we need to start realizing that, because if they truly want our water, then they're going to have to understand that this is a very flexible commodity we have, and the way that we have to go about acquiring those that product of water for them is going to have to be very creative as much as it is unique to each and every irrigator. And I think that when we look at these things, we just can't have a no, we can't, because they won't. I also think we've been too defensive all the time on the QSA. We seem to always be giving in and losing ground. I want to look at this valley 20, 30, 50 years from now and have our kids and grandkids say, well, you know what? Our folks took care of us, because this isn't a dried up landscape as it potentially could be because of what we're doing today. It's important that we really recognize the decisions that we're making are going to really affect the generations to come. And this water belongs to us. And when we sell it or transfer it or whatever it may be, maybe we need to start applying a 417 to the recipients of said water, because it's still ours. We just sold it for a price, and if they're going to apply a 417 to us, then we should apply one to them for the use of our water. And let's be on the offensive a little bit more. I think that it's very disheartening for us to always see that we always seem to be losing at every end of the battle, and it's important for the water users and the irrigators in this community alone to recognize that the industry of agriculture is very, very important, and the driver, if you will, to this economy. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McBroom. Anybody else have any public comments? Mr. Jordan, if anybody wants to say anything, would you line up over here against the west wall, please?
Can I contradict myself?
Okay.
Rusty Jordan Brawley. I'm sorry I haven't had a time to read the whole report, but I do notice on page 9, the case, after discussing that the promise of the state was to be constitutional and that the state can appropriate funds, the whole issue of the crux of the appeal. It goes on, the case has been remanded to lower courts for an evaluation of the remaining environmental issues under the federal and state environmental laws. And I also thought that the appellate court remanded to address Brown Act and open meeting issues, which in themselves have more of a chance of invalidating the QSA and CEQA, because in general, CEQA can be remedied. If you did an error in your environmental report, they can remand you to repair it. If you didn't look at something, you have to look at it and report it. Whereas the case where the agreement was still under negotiation with the state, and the board voted, and then the contract was changed. While that may not be it might not kill it, it is something that is before the court that could kill it. And the other thing is that as I understand it, the QSA, as far as an agricultural water user, is voluntary. I haven't signed anything with the IID to agree to conserve water, but I assume I can continue to get my water, and then I should get a benefit if I sign up to conserve water. And that means that I think 80-some% of the people have to agree with contracts that haven't been made to conserve water to produce the water. And I didn't hear that discussed. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mr. Jordan. Mr. Benson.
Hi, Steve Benson, Brawley. I appreciate Chuck for coming back in the middle of the summer wearing a suit, more than I could do. Also, I think it's a good first step that this board took in hiring him and following it through all the way to the end. It's been a long time coming that the QSA needs to be re-looked at. In 2003, when it was passed, there was a lot of discussion, a lot of feelings that it was going to go a certain way, from the sense that it was a done deal. It's been already amended 5 times, and I think we would be ready for a 6th amendment if it helped protect the Imperial Valley. I do have a couple quick questions and then some comments on some of the findings that you had. And one is on the committees. I'm concerned, and other people have raised the concern, that more committees, more meetings is just more bureaucracy for the IID. Also, putting a general manager as the chair of all these committees, I think, would take away more of his time from managing an organization. Personally, I think the water manager or someone assigned in the water department should be chairing those committees and putting the time in to really look out to communicate that not only to the board level but to the GM and to the public. Also, I think that the budget was a little confusing in the sense that I have a couple budget-related questions for you. What, in your 40-year plan, you show a $1 billion shortfall. My question is, what are the assumptions of that? There was some conservation was 52% of the total costs. Mitigation by IID was 14%. But my assumption is we're not obligated to make any mitigation above the JPA currently. There was an extra $1.1 million. Also, you had 1.1 billion, another 1.7 billion going to O&M for the water department. There was other environmental costs of 1.9 billion, and then the total IID conservation was only 3.5 billion, with a total revenue of 9 billion. So my question is the IID going to put numbers to these to try to marry the two? Or is this just a report that gets filed and then we wait 10 years and when we find out we don't have enough money, then we're up creek without a paddle? There's another question I have is, when does a shortfall exist where IID must step up to start this mitigation? There's an understanding that there's a moving target on the environmental of the Salton Sea. We know the water's going down. No one can point to a time and place where the money has to go in. The JPA costs have not been expended. My understanding is once the JPA has worked itself through, that the IID would have to step up or walk away from the QSA. And then who takes the liability of Salton Sea mitigation if the state does not step up? Once the JPA has gone through their process, the Salton Sea is going to sit there and no one's going to be taking care of it unless the IID starts kicking in extra dollars. And then if we could just get publicly the same data that was given to your attorney as far as the spreadsheets for the water transfer assumptions. They are not available online. If they are, please tell me where. I have an old report that was from 2010 that Mr. Broken gave me. Thank you. It is now 2012. And I think we can have more current data available to the public. If there's a reason it should be withheld from the public, I would like to understand why. I think a lot of the data that went into this report needs to be made public so people can do their own analysis and understand the pricing models of the water. It is public data. You've signed agreements that the public should know what the future of the valley holds. There's a lot of people that don't understand the QSA, but when you start talking about $9 billion over 40 years, I mean, you're not even going out the full 70 years or 75 years. So I hope that a lot of this gets brought up and is available on the 18th. I know it's a short time period, and Greg's also working on budgets right now, but appreciate it. Do you have any answers on the?
I do. First on the committees, we picked a structure we thought might work. How you internally set up committees, I don't know. I mean, you would know best it would be the IID, the general manager and the board as to how to structure the committees. But in my view, it's vital to have some entity, some group of people that are responsible for management of this gargantuan agreement within the IID. Maybe it's committees, I don't really know. I mean, I just hate the idea of recommending committees, but I wanted to, that committee to me is code for getting people in charge and making sure that they have outreach to the communities. I'm not. On the other one, the three assumptions that went into that created the huge deficit were the following. Right now, much of the revenues of the IID are being used to subsidize the water department. Right. If that's an ongoing obligation, then it's going to continue to be over the life of the QSA. If they're going to stop doing that, then they're going to raise revenues. We didn't see any proposal to raise revenues elsewhere. We saw proposals to engage in bond financing, which is always a good idea unless your bond financing is based on a revenue stream that's not guaranteed. The revenue stream from the QSA is problematic given all of the issues, even though it's substantial. So that's one. On the environmental costs, what we did there was we simply said, look, the documents that were provided to us in the definite plan and in the environmental analysis of what the state would have to pay, over $133 million, we said, let's accept those costs as being correct. If they are, when you get to $133 million, then somebody has to do it. Right. It's just like, the analogy I would think was, geez, I just wrecked my car and I suffered, a tremendous amount of damage. I suffered $1 million of damage, but thank goodness the law of New Mexico has a $300,000 cap on damages awards. Well, it doesn't protect you if you live there to have a cap on the amount you have to pay. If you live there, then somebody's got to step up and pay it. That was the logic there. And so if it's going to, and the response is, well, it's not our duty. It's not a legal duty. You can't include in a budget that which you don't have the obligation to pay. I don't understand the logic of that. Somebody's going to pay it. And so that was, if we're wrong in that assumption, if it's just going to sit there after that time, then we're wrong. But that was the logic. The third number you talked about, we said there's the Salton Sea. There's the Salton Sea. It's nominal. It's a huge problem. It's going down. Maybe some small quantity of money would be put in by the IID to help on that problem. Maybe not. But if you add those together, you come up with a deficit. These are just illustrative concerns. Nobody knows what's going to happen over the next period of time. But let me just say, if you don't do the mitigation required by the State Water Resources Control Board, and even though it's required and nobody steps up to pay, then the QSA says that if your permit goes away, you can't transfer the water. If you can't transfer the water, you don't get paid, and the entire problem is right back at you as soon as you run out of money. So we were just trying to illustrate the uncertainties. We're not trying to say we know for sure what the future is. We're just illustrating one future.
I had one other quick question, and it was, if we don't conserve enough water to meet the obligations of the QSA, who has to come up with either the water, because San Diego is going to be short water. My understanding is that someone told me the IID has to pay for them to go find water somewhere else. I don't believe that that's true, but we just transfer less and have less in revenue, is my point.
That's more of a legal question.
I'd like to, I think, let me
and
just,
we should be careful.
Yeah, I agree with that. Here's the point. Here's the problem we've run into. We were instructed, even though Patrick's a member of the California Bar and I'm litigated in lots of courts, we don't want to be offering up legal opinions, even though that's a good and legitimate question. You know, do you have to cover, you know, is it the opportunity cost of buying water somewhere else? I guess my view on that is that under these circumstances, if it's separate and apart from what the contract may require and all of those issues that you raise about who has to pay what to whom, it just seems to me that in terms of water law and reasonable and beneficial use, if you've done your very best to conform to the requirements of a contract and it's an impossibility because it can't be done under those terms, then you're going to have a lot of litigation and discussion over that. But it's a very good equitable argument that if you've tried your best to do it, then you shouldn't be obligated to do more than what you can. But we were instructed to not do law, and we didn't do any law in this report.
I mean, Mr. Benson, the answer on that is that there would be arguments that were breach of contracts. There might be arguments that we have a responsibility to pay damages. It's certainly not a clear-cut answer. It's not just, you're going to have to do this. There's going to be a dispute. There's going to be a dispute under the agreement. The agreement provides very limited language about how such disputes would be handled. We could spend a lot of time in closed session, maybe a little bit of time in open session, but it's certainly not just a simple, clear-cut, this is what happens.
Right.
Unfortunately.
You're going to clarify.
Okay. I would only recommend that the board look at also the financial pricing of water in California and develop some sort of a track record to look at other water districts and what Palo Verde's done, and not because we want to sell more water, but just to see if we're getting our fair share for what San Diego's paying other people in MWD, because I think it's important. A lot of people feel that the valley's being shorted on what we're actually getting for the water and not covering the costs of selling it and sending it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Benson. Anybody else have public comments, please?
I have a comment I'd like to make to Mr. Benson.
Yeah, go ahead.
Mr. Benson, I would advise you to look at the minutes and look at the record, what legal counsel actually said. I think you'll find that what was said was exactly what you I think it will verify the question that you asked.
Was it?
That's what was directed to this board.
Was it my recollection? Was it me, Director Hanks, or other legal counsel?
No, it was other.
Okay, because I don't remember saying that.
Yeah.
Mr. Gonzalez.
Thank you. Mr. Dumars, in the spirit of clarification of the QSA, I would like to ask you a question, but I want to preface it by stating I'm not responsible for what I say. However, I am not responsible for what people understand what I say. My point is, many people give their opinions, questions, concepts, or paradigms or theories on the QSA. I'm not so sure that I understand where they're coming from. But many people that are running for office, including Mr. Benson and Mr. Kuhn and Mr. Maldonado, many people believe they can give an opinion on all matters without having the facts, the experience, and records, just what you stated, Mr. Hanks, on the QSA. The question that I would like to ask Mr. Dumars, you stated, I think in the paper, and you stated it again today, that the IID, meaning us, weren't responsible on the waste of water, and IID should challenge the status of the QSA and go forward. What did you mean by that explicitly, sir?
If you're not responsible for your question, am I not responsible for my answer, I guess? What I meant to say, and if I wasn't clear, what I meant to say was, and what I thought I said was, that at some point in a juncture where irrigators do everything they can to conserve water, and to make them conserve more would put them out of business because it's not economically feasible, then in that case, what the irrigator does, is not a waste. The fact that they continue to farm using the best technology available to them is not waste. It's just raw political power to try to squeeze people out of the farming business. That's all I said. And I continue to say it's not waste. Let me just make one other comment, though, just so you know. I have been working on this for a long. We worked on it, our law firm. We've looked at these issues. We've hired a really good CPA and a great ag engineer. In the entire time that I've worked on this, not a single board member has ever suggested to me any outcome or anything that would suggest that a particular point of view should be adopted. It's been remarkable. Kevin, I've talked to Kevin. He's never said you ought to do this or gee, we've had no influence. The board has been superb in their willingness to communicate but never try to persuade. And so that to me, that was, in addition to being a great experience being here, it's just the fact the board did nothing to try to affect the outcome is important.
Thank you, Chuck. Anybody else have any public comments for Mr. DeMars or this Plan B, Mr. Horn?
Good afternoon, Mr. President, members of the board. Andy Horn from the County of Imperial. Thanks. I just had a question. I was reading in the executive summary on page 20. It says, and maybe I'm reading it wrong, it says that IID anticipates issuing debt in the amount of $39,270,000. That looks like a misprint to me, except that it's repeated on page 94 of the general report. That I know that maybe Greg left the room. Now he's coming back. It seems like 39. I think several hundred years ago, when I was on the board, we borrowed something like that just to pay for the environmental documents toward the QSA implementation. And it just seems like $39 million is an awful low figure for financing the capital improvements that are reflected in the budget tables on this report.
Yep. Mr. Broking, did you hear that question? It's on page 94, and it has to do with the $39 million.
It's got to be an error, and it probably should be corrected before this thing gets out.
Yeah,
in a final form.
You're absolutely right.
And then the final question or comment that I had, a couple of comments. I heard one part of the presentation where, this idea or concept of local control was gaining momentum as evidenced by the possibility or the moving forward of AB 939. I don't know, Antonio, 939 was, it didn't make it. So I don't know if that's any indication of how much local support or support for locals control there is in Sacramento, but it doesn't seem like that went very far. Then the final thing I'd say that you got some, in these resolutions, you've got some committee structures proposed, and of course it's up to you guys, and Stella.
Thank you.
What you do with that. I would just go way out on a limb and say that, in particular in regards to that environmental committee, you have some proposed structure of that the county would perhaps be a natural player in that. We have a public health department, and not to give any more work to Brad over here, we have an air pollution control district that I think would be helpful or constructive, including in that committee if you decide to go ahead and form it. And so we'd look forward to helping in any way we can.
Thank you, Mr. Horn. Anybody else from the public have any comments on Mr. DeMars' report? Okay, seeing none, I will bring it back to the board. Any board member comments before we wrap this up?
I would like to make a comment. First, I like to thank Mr. DeMars and his crew for the work they've done. But even more importantly, I really appreciate the way you deliver your message, and you're hearing that from a guy that's not always the calmest and not polished in the way I say things. But in your report, I'm truly amazed at how receptive the people in the Imperial Valley have been to you, the people here today. And I think that's an indication that we need to pay attention to as we move forward and turn the corner on a document that we know just by the nature of circumstances, since it was signed, is going to require some changes made to it. Probably the single most important item of your principles that jumped out at me was the comment that you made: for every significant legal interpretation involving the QSA, it is the duty of the board to demonstrate to the public that the legal position taken by the IID comports with and ensures compliance with the above described missions, the ones you're talking about. But I think it's also important that we do the same on our legal arguments in court, that as a board, we're able to explain to the public why a position has been taken and so forth. And I haven't always felt comfortable with that. And I appreciate these comments, and particularly the way you said it, and a non-challenging matter. I mean, I didn't see any reaction from anybody towards the way you said it. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Director Hanks. Any of the other directors?
Yeah, I'd like to also thank Mr. DeMars for the presentations, not only this presentation, the other presentations, and the conversations and the emails. The limited amount of communication we've had has been very easy as far as transferring knowledge or information or getting a feel for where we're going or where we're trying to go. And I thank you for your even-handedness in dealing with the board and with the community. I also like to recognize how well the community has accepted you. Every presentation you've made here before us has been very well attended and by the public sector, of all aspects of Imperial County's public sector, which is not the norm for an IID board meeting. Generally, it's a majority of IID staff in the audience, so it's always a pleasure having the public here. But it really shows the significance of this issue and your works that are being done. Mr. Horn's, Andy Horn's comments about the committees and the concerns are heard loud and clear. I'll be taking a look at the proposals that are coming forward there and having some input there. And I agree with you, Andy, that the county, specifically the Air Pollution Control District, should play a significant factor on as many of those committees that they need to participate in. I look forward to addressing these proposals, these policies, the principles as they've been presented today in the form of resolutions. And I believe there's 3 resolutions. Is that correct, Mr. DeMars? So we'll be addressing that here in the near future. On the 18th is what I'm being told. So we'll have time to take a look at those, and hopefully a favorable outcome will come there, and we can carry this message and this momentum and this attendance today in the audience from everyone that's here as we move forward. Finally, the executive summary that has been put together, the narrative, the way it reads, and it's not entirely short. It's some 90 pages, but I highly recommend it to everybody, especially candidates running for the IID board, to read. It's very easy reading. It gets you up to speed as to what this QSA is, what are the problems with the QSA, where are we at today. So many of us in the public sector, in any sector, don't understand what the QSA is all about. It's complicated. It's overwhelming. We don't want to take on anything else in our lives that's hard to understand. But yet it's so political. It's so advertised out there and complained about and talked about and contested in court. So much money's been spent on it. So the newspaper, I highly recommend the newspaper to take a look at this executive summary and get a feel for where we're at, written by an outside source doing work for the IID. Things change over time. What Mr. DeMars has said about the economies and how it's changed in the last 10 years and how it's impacted all of us, how we're supposed to survive and live with what we have today as compared to what we had 10 years ago, how we're supposed to live and survive today with the QSA as compared to how it was presented some 10 plus years ago. So once again, I just recommend that everybody take a look at this executive summary if you really want to get a feel for what the QSA is and where we're at. Take a look at this, and thank you, Mr. DeMars, for your efforts.
Thank you, Director Desert. Director Mendoza?
Don't call me Director Desert.
Oh, no, I said thank you, Director Desert.
Okay, I thought you called me Director Desert.
Oh.
Anyway, again, I want to thank you, Mr. DeMars, and your staff for coming here today. And I will look at your resolutions and your narrative summary and keep an open mind. When I met you the first time we met in New Mexico, I told you I would do my best to meet you halfway, keep an open mind, and I will do my due diligence, and I will do what I think is best for the Imperial Valley. And I do thank you for your performance, and you put a lot of time, a lot of your knowledge of the history, I can tell by reading your material that you can grasp the complexity of the QSA, and I appreciate that. And so I will give it my best to read your material completely and come back with a decision that I think that will be best for the Imperial Valley. Okay.
Chuck, I want to thank you for all the time you've spent and all the effort that you put into working on this Plan B to try to improve the QSA, give us a better resolution here for the ag industry and the people here in this valley to protect us from a potential liability that does exist out there. I know it's a big unknown, but I know I started with reading your amicus brief that you had a long time ago, probably 2 years back, and realize that there's always been an argument about the liability of the Salton Sea and who ends up paying for it, whether the state steps up to the plate or it falls on the backs of the landowners or who. And so I think it's important that you've come before this board. This board has accepted you and brought you in here to look at what the liability is and how that we can improve upon the QSA that we have and make it better for the Imperial Valley and take care of the problems that we have with the Salton Sea and the landowners and the residents here of Imperial County. So I'm looking forward to bringing these resolutions back on the 18th and any further work that you can do, and working especially with the Water Conservation Advisory Board on any future on-farm and system conservation as we move forward. So I thank you for coming, thank Patrick, and I look forward to working with you in the future. So thank you very much. And I guess, Mr. Kelly, is there anything else?
Only that Mr. DeMars will be joining us next week in Brawley and Calexico for what we're calling community outreach. The meeting in Brawley is at Lions Center. Lions Center at 5 o'clock on September 12th, and the following night in Calexico at City Hall, also at 5 o'clock. And Mr. DeMars will be coordinating his efforts with Mr. Silva and members of the Water Department following this meeting. Thank you.
Okay, and with that, I guess we'll adjourn the meeting. I appreciate everybody coming for this workshop. Thank you.